Chapter 8 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Further inquiry. Did you happen to notice, Mrs. Pierce, whether Miss Lloyd was wearing a yellow rose when you saw her in her room? Mrs. Pierce hesitated. She looked decidedly embarrassed and seemed disinclined to answer. But she might have known that to hesitate and show embarrassment was almost equivalent to an affirmative answer to the coroner's question. At last she replied, "I don't know. I didn't notice." This might have been a true statement, but I think no one in the room believed it. The coroner tried again. "Try to think, Mrs. Pierce. It is important that we should know if Miss Lloyd was wearing a yellow rose." "Yes," flared out Mrs. Pierce angrily, "so that you can prove she went down to her uncle's office later and dropped a piece of her rose there. But I tell you I don't remember whether she was wearing a rose or not, and it wouldn't matter if she had on 40 roses. If Florence Lloyd says she didn't go downstairs, she didn't." "I think we all believe in Miss Lloyd's veracity," said Mr. Monroe, "but it is necessary to discover where those rose petals in the library came from. You saw the flowers in her room, Mrs. Pierce?" "Yes, I believe I did, but I paid no attention to them, as Florence nearly always had flowers in her room." "Would you have heard Miss Lloyd if she had gone downstairs after you left her?" "I don't know," said Mrs. Pierce doubtfully. "Is your room next to hers?" "No, not next." "Is it on the same corridor?" "No." "Around a corner?" "Yes." "And at some distance?" "Yes." Mrs. Pierce's answers became more hesitating as she saw the drift of Mr. Monroe's questions. Clearly, she was trying to shield Florence, if necessary, at the expense of actual truthfulness. "Then," went on Mr. Monroe inexorably, "I understand you to say that you think you would have heard Miss Lloyd had she gone downstairs, although your room is at a distance and around a corner, and the hall and stairs are thickly carpeted. Unless you were listening especially, Mrs. Pierce, I think you would scarcely have heard her descend." "Well, as she didn't go down, of course I didn't hear her," snapped Mrs. Pierce, with the feminine way of settling an argument by an unprovable statement. Mr. Monroe began on another tack. "When you went to Miss Lloyd's room," he said, "was the maid, Elsa, there?" "Miss Lloyd had just dismissed her for the night." "What was Miss Lloyd doing when you went to her room?" "She was looking over some gowns that she proposed sending to the cleaners." The coroner fairly jumped. He remembered the newspaper clipping of a cleaner's advertisement, which was even now in the gold bag before him. Though all the jurors had seen it, it had not been referred to in the presence of the women. Recovering himself at once, he said quietly, "Was that not rather work for Miss Lloyd's maid?" "Oh, Elsa would pack and send them, of course," said Mrs. Pierce carelessly. "Miss Lloyd was merely deciding which ones needed cleaning." "Do you know where they were to be sent?" Mrs. Pierce looked a little surprised at this question. "Miss Lloyd always sends her things to Carter & Brown's," she said. Now Carter & Brown was the firm name on the advertisement, and it was evident at once that the coroner considered this a damaging admission. He sat looking greatly troubled, but before he spoke again, Mr. Parmalee made an observation that decidedly raised that young man in my estimation. "Well," he said, "that's pretty good proof that the gold bag doesn't belong to Miss Lloyd." "How so?" asked the coroner, who had thought quite the contrary. "Why, if Miss Lloyd always sends her goods to be cleaned at Carter & Brown, why would she need to cut their address from a newspaper and save it?" At first I thought the young man's deduction distinctly clever, but on second thought I wasn't so sure. Miss Lloyd might have wanted that address for a dozen good reasons. To my mind, it proved neither her ownership of the gold bag nor the contrary. In fact, I thought the most important indication that the bag might be hers lay in the story Elsa told about the cousin who sailed to Germany. Somehow that sounded untrue to me, but I was more than willing to believe it if I could. I longed for Fleming Stone, who, I felt sure, could learn from the bag and its contents the whole truth about the crime and the criminal. But I had been called to take charge of the case, and my pride forbade me to call on any one for help. I had scorned deductions from inanimate objects, but I resolved to study the bag again, and study it more minutely. Perhaps there were some threads or shreds caught in its message that might prove its owner. I remembered a detective story I read once, in which the whole discovery of the criminal depended on identifying a few dark blue woolen threads which were found in a small pool of candle grease on a veranda roof. As it turned out, they were from the trouser knee of a man who had knelt there to open a window. The patent absurdity of leaving threads from one's trouser knee amused me very much, but the accommodating criminals in fiction almost always leave threads or shreds behind them. And surely a gold mesh bag, with its thousands of links, would be a fine trap to catch some threads of evidence, however minute they might be. Furthermore, I decided to probe further into that yellow rose business. I was not at all sure that those petals I found on the floor had anything to do with Miss Lloyd's roses, but it must be a question possible of settlement, if I went about it in the right way. At any rate, though I had definite work ahead of me, my duty just now was to listen to the forthcoming evidence, though I could not help thinking I could have put questions more to the point than Mr. Monroe did. Of course, the coroner's inquest was not formally conducted as a trial by a jury would be, and so anyone spoke, if he chose, and the coroner seemed really glad when suggestions were offered him. At this point, Philip Crawford rose. "It is impossible," he said, "not to see whither these questions are tending. But you are on the wrong track, Mr. Coroner. No matter how evidence may seem to point toward Florence Lloyd's association with this crime, it is only seeming. That gold bag might have been hers and it might not. But if she says it isn't, why then it isn't. Notwithstanding the state of affairs between my brother and his niece, there is not the shadow of a possibility that the young woman is implicated in the slightest degree, and the sooner you leave her name out of consideration and turn your search into other channels, the sooner you will find the real criminal." It was not so much the words of Philip Crawford as the sincere way in which they were spoken that impressed me. Surely he was right. Surely this beautiful girl was neither principal nor accessory in the awful crime which, by strange coincidence, gave to her her fortune and her lover. "Mr. Crawford's right," said Lemuel Porter. "If this jury allows itself to be misled by a gold purse and 2 petals of a yellow rose, we are unworthy to sit on this case. Why, Mr. Coroner, the long French windows in the office were open, at least unfastened, all through the night. We have that from the butler's testimony. He didn't lock them last night, and they were found unlocked this morning. Therefore I hold that an intruder, either man or woman, may have come in during the night, accomplished the fatal deed, and departed without anyone being the wiser. That this intruder was a woman is evidenced by the bag she left behind her. For as Mr. Crawford has said, if Miss Lloyd denies the ownership of the bag, it is not hers. After all, these declarations were proof of a sort. If Mr. Porter and Mr. Philip Crawford, who had known Florence Lloyd for years, spoke thus positively of her innocence, it could not be doubted. And then the voice of Parmalee again sounded in my ears. "Of course Mr. Porter and Mr. Crawford would stand up for Miss Lloyd. It would be strange if they didn't. And of course Mrs. Pierce will do all she can to divert suspicion. But the evidences are against her." "They only seem to be," I corrected. "Until we prove the gold bag and the yellow rose to be hers, there is no evidence against her at all. She also had motive and opportunity. Those 2 points are of quite as much importance as evidence." "She had motive and opportunity," I agreed. "But they were not exclusive. As Mr. Porter pointed out, the open windows gave opportunity that was world wide, and as to motive, how are we to know who or who hadn't it?" "You're right, I suppose. Perhaps I'm too positive of Miss Lloyd's implication in the matter, but I'm quite willing to be convinced to the contrary." The remarks of Mr. Parmalee were of course not audible to any one save myself, but the speeches which had been made by Mr. Crawford and Mr. Porter, and which, strange to say, amounted to an arraignment and vindication almost in the same breath, had a decided effect upon the assembly. Mrs. Pierce began to weep silently. Gregory Hall looked startled, as if the mere idea of Miss Lloyd's implication was a new thought to him. Lawyer Randolph looked considerably disturbed, and I at once suspected that his legal mind would not allow him to place too much dependence on the statement of the girl's sympathetic friends. Mr. Hamilton, another of the jurors, whom I liked, seemed to be thoughtfully weighing the evidence. He was not so well acquainted with Miss Lloyd as the two men who had just spoken in her behalf, and he made a remark somewhat diffidently. "I agree," he said, "with the sentiments just expressed, but I also think that we should endeavor to find some further clues or evidence. Had Mr. Crawford any enemies who could come at night to kill him? Or are there any valuables missing? Could robbery have been the motive?" "It does not seem so," replied the coroner. "Nothing is known to be missing. Mr. Crawford's watch and pocket money were not disturbed." "The absence of the weapon is a strange factor in the case," put in Mr. Orville, apparently desirous of having his voice heard as well as those of the other jurors. "Yes," agreed Mr. Monroe, "yet it is not strange that the criminal carried away with him what might have been a proof of his identity." "Does Miss Lloyd own a pistol?" blurted out Mr. Parmalee. Gregory Hall gave him an indignant look, but Coroner Monroe seemed rather glad to have the question raised, probably so that it could be settled at once in the negative. And it was. "No," replied Mrs. Pierce, when the query was put to her. "Both Florence and I are desperately afraid of firearms. We wouldn't dream of owning a pistol, either of us." Of course this was significant, but in no way decisive. Granting that Miss Lloyd could have been the criminal, it would have been possible for her to secretly procure a revolver, and secretly to dispose of it afterward. Then, too, a small revolver had been used. To be sure, this did not necessarily imply that a woman had used it, but taken in connection with the bag and the rose petals, it gave food for thought. But the coroner seemed to think Mrs. Pierce's assertions greatly in Miss Lloyd's favor, and being at the end of his list of witnesses, he inquired if anyone else in the room knew of anything that could throw light on the matter. No one responded to this invitation, and the coroner then directed the jury to retire to find a verdict. The 6 men passed into another room, and I think no one who awaited their return apprehended any other result than the somewhat unsatisfactory one of person or persons unknown. And this was what the foreman announced when the jury returned after their short collocation. Then, as a jury, they were dismissed, but from that moment the mystery of Joseph Crawford's death became the absorbing thought of all West Sedgwick. "The murderer of my brother shall be found and brought to justice," declared Philip Crawford, and all present seemed to echo his vow. Then and there Mr. Crawford retained Lawyer Randolph to help him in running down the villain, and turning to me, asked to engage my services also. To this I readily agreed, for I greatly desired to go on with the matter, and cared little whether I worked for an individual or for the state. Of course, Mr. Crawford's determination to find the murderer proved anew his conviction that Florence Lloyd was above all suspicion, but in the face of certain details of the evidence so far, I could not feel so absolutely certain of this. However, it was my business to follow up every clue, or apparent clue, and every bit of evidence, and this I made up my mind to do, regardless of consequences. I confess it was difficult for me to feel regardless of consequences, for I had a haunting fear that the future was going to look dark for Florence Lloyd, and if it should be proved that she was in any way responsible for or accessory to this crime, I knew I should wish I had had nothing to do with discovering that fact. But back of this was an undefined but insistent conviction that the girl was innocent, and that I could prove it. This may have been an inordinate faith in my own powers, or it may have been a hope born of my admiration for the young woman herself, for there is no doubt that for the first time in my life I was taking a serious interest in a woman's personality. Heretofore I had been a general admirer of womankind, and I had naturally treated them all with chivalry and respect. But now I had met one whom I desired to treat in a far tenderer way. And to my chagrin I realized that I had no right to entertain such thoughts towards a girl already betrothed. So I concluded to try my best to leave Florence Lloyd's personality out of the question, to leave my feelings toward her out of the question, and to devote my energies to real work on the case and prove by intelligent effort that I could learn facts from evidence without resorting to the microscopic methods of Fleming Stone. I purposely ignored the fact that I would have been only too glad to use these methods had I the power to do so. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The 12th rose. For the next day or two the Crawford house presented the appearance usual in any home during the days immediately preceding a funeral. By tacit consent, all reference to the violence of Mr. Crawford's death was avoided, and a rigorous formality was the keynote of all the ceremonies. The servants were garbed in correct mourning. The ladies of the house refused to see anybody, and all personal callers were met by Philip Crawford or his wife, while business acquaintances were received by Gregory Hall. As private secretary, of course, Mr. Hall was in full charge of Mr. Crawford's papers and personal effects. But in addition to this, as the prospective husband of the heiress, he was practically the head of the house. He showed no elation or ostentation at this state of affairs, but carried himself with an air of quiet dignity, tinged with a suggestion of sadness which, if merely conventional, seemed none the less sincere. I soon learned that the whole social atmosphere of West Sedgwick was one of extreme formality, and everything was done in accordance with the most approved conventions. Therefore, I found I could get no chance for a personal conversation with Miss Lloyd until after the funeral. I had, however, more or less talk with Gregory Hall, and as I became acquainted with him, I liked him less. He was of a cold and calculating disposition, and when we were alone, he did not hesitate to gloat openly over his bright prospects. "Terrible thing to be put out of existence like that," he said, as we sat in Mr. Crawford's office, looking over some papers. "But it solved a big problem for Florence and me. However, we'll be married as soon as we decently can, and then we'll go abroad and forget the tragic part of it all." "I suppose you haven't a glimmer of suspicion as to who did it?" I ventured. "No, I haven't, not the faintest notion, but I wish you could find out. Of course, nobody holds up that bag business as against Florence, but it's uncomfortable all the same. I wish I'd been here that night. I'm most sure I'd have heard a shot or something." "Where were you?" I said in a careless tone. Hall drew himself up stiffly. "Excuse me," he said. "I declined to answer that question before. Since I was not in West Sedgwick, it can matter to no one where I was." "Oh, that's all right," I returned affably, for I had no desire to get his ill will. "But of course we detectives have to ask questions. By the way, where did you buy Miss Lloyd's yellow roses?" "See here," said Gregory Hall, with a petulant expression, "I don't want to be questioned. I'm not on the witness stand, and as I've told you, I'm uncomfortable already about these so-called clues that seem to implicate Miss Lloyd. So, if you please, I'll say nothing." "All right," I responded, "just as you like." I went away from the house, thinking how foolish people could be. I could easily discover where he bought the roses, as there were only 3 florist shops in West Sedgwick, and I resolved to go at once to hunt up the florist who sold them. Assuming he would naturally go to the shop nearest the railroad station, and which was also on my way from the Crawford house, I went there first and found my assumption correct. The florist was more than willing to talk on the subject. "Yes, sir," he said. "I sold those roses to Mr. Hall. Sold 'em to him myself. He wanted something extra nice. And I had just a dozen of those big yellow beauties. No, I don't raise my own flowers. I get 'em from the city. And so I had just that dozen. And I sent 'em right up. Well, there was some delay, for 2 of my boys were out to supper, and I waited for one to get back." And you had no other roses just like these in stock?" "No, sir. Hadn't had for a week or more. Haven't any now. May not get in any more at all. They are a scarce sort, at best, and especially so this year." "And you sent Miss Lloyd the whole dozen?" "Yes, sir, 12. I like to put in an extra one or two when I can, but that time I couldn't. There wasn't another rose like them, short of New York City." I thanked the florist, and guessing that he was not above it, I gave him a more material token of my gratitude for his information, and then walked slowly back to my room at the inn. Since there were no other roses of that sort in West Sedgwick that evening, it seemed to me as if Florence Lloyd must have gone down to her uncle's office after having pinned the blossom on her bodice. The only other possibility was that some intruder had entered by the way of the French window wearing or carrying a similar flower, and that this intruder had come from New York, or at least from some place other than West Sedgwick. It was too absurd. Murderers don't go about decked with flowers, and yet at midnight a man in evening dress was not impossible, and evening dress might easily imply a boutonniere. Well, this well-dressed man I had conjured up in my mind must have come from out of town, or else whence the flower, after all. And then I bethought myself of that late newspaper. An extra, printed probably as late as 11 o'clock at night, must have been brought out to West Sedgwick by a traveler on some late train. Why not Gregory Hall himself? I let my imagination run riot for a minute. Mr. Hall refused to say where he was on the night of the murder. Why not assume that he had come out from New York in evening dress at or about midnight? This would account for the newspaper and the yellow rose petals, for, if he bought a boutonniere in the city, how probable he would select the same flower he had just sent his fiancée. I rather fancied the idea of Gregory Hall as the criminal. He had the same motive as Miss Lloyd. He knew of her uncle's objection to their union and his threat of disinheritance. How easy for him to come out late from New York on a night when he was not expected, and remove forever the obstacle to his future happiness. I drew myself up with a start. This was not detective work. This was mere idle speculation. I must shake it off and set about collecting some real evidence. But the thought still clung to me. Mere speculation it might be, but it was founded on the same facts that already threw suspicion on Florence Lloyd. With the exception of the gold bag, and that she disclaimed, such evidence as I knew of pointed toward Mr. Hall as well as toward Miss Lloyd. However, at present I was on the trail of those roses, and I determined to follow that trail to a definite end. I went back to the Crawford house, and as I did not like to ask for Miss Lloyd, I asked for Mrs. Pierce. She came down to the drawing room and greeted me rather more cordially than I had dared to hope. I had a feeling that both ladies resented my presence there, for so many women have a prejudice against detectives. But though nervous and agitated, Mrs. Pierce spoke to me kindly. "Did you want to see me for anything in particular, Mr. Burroughs?" she asked. "Yes, I do, Mrs. Pierce," I replied. "I may as well tell you frankly that I want to find out all I can about those yellow roses." "Oh, those roses! Shall I never hear the last of them? I assure you, Mr. Burroughs, they're of no importance whatever." "That is not for you to decide," I said quietly, and I began to see that perhaps a dictatorial attitude might be the best way to manage this lady. "Are the rest of those flowers still in Miss Lloyd's room? If so, I wish to see them." "I don't know whether they are or not, but I will find out, and if so, I'll bring them down." "No," I said, "I will go with you to see them." "But Florence may be in her room." "So much the better. She can tell me anything I wish to know." "Oh, please don't interview her. I'm sure she wouldn't want to talk with you." "Very well, then, ask her to vacate the room, and I will go there with you now." Mrs. Pierce went away, and I began to wonder if I had gone too far or had overstepped my authority. But it was surely my duty to learn all I could about Florence Lloyd, and what so promising of suggestions as her own room. Mrs. Pierce returned in a few moments, and affably enough she asked me to accompany her to Miss Lloyd's room. I did so, and after entering, devoted my whole attention to the bunch of yellow roses, which in a glass vase stood on the window seat. Although somewhat wilted, they were still beautiful, and without the slightest doubt were the kind of rose from which the two telltale petals had fallen. Acting upon a sudden thought, I counted them. There were 9, each one seemingly with its full complement of petals, though of this I could not be perfectly certain. "Now, Mrs. Pierce," I said, turning to her with an air of authority which was becoming difficult to maintain, "where are the roses which Miss Lloyd admits having pinned to her gown?" "Mercy, I don't know!" exclaimed Mrs. Pierce, looking bewildered. "I suppose she threw them away." "I suppose she did," I returned. "Would she not be likely to throw them in the waste basket?" "She might," returned Mrs. Pierce, turning toward an ornate affair of wicker work and pink ribbons. Sure enough, in the basket, among a few scraps of paper, were 2 exceedingly withered yellow roses. I picked them out and examined them, but in their present state it was impossible to tell whether they had lost any petals or not, so I threw them back in the basket. Mrs. Pierce seemed to care nothing for evidence or deduction in the matter, but began to lament the carelessness of the chambermaid who had not emptied the waste basket the day before. But I secretly blessed the delinquent servant, and began pondering on this new development of the rose question. The 9 roses in the vase and the 2 in the basket made but 11, and the florist had told me that he had sent a dozen. Where was the 12th? The thought occurred to me that Miss Lloyd might have put away one as a sentimental souvenir, but to my mind she did not seem the kind of girl to do that. I knew my reasoning was absurd, for what man can predicate what a woman will do? But at the same time I could not seem to imagine the statuesque, imperial Miss Lloyd tenderly preserving a rose that her lover had given her. But might not Gregory Hall have taken one of the roses for himself before sending the rest? This was merely surmise, but it was a possibility, and at any rate the 12th rose was not in Miss Lloyd's room. Therefore the 12th rose was a factor to be reckoned with, a bit of evidence to be found, and I determined to find it. I asked Mrs. Pierce to arrange for me an interview with Miss Lloyd, but the elder lady seemed doubtful. "I am quite sure she won't see you," she said, "for she has declared she will see no one until after the funeral. But if you want me to ask her anything for you, I will do so." "Very well," I said, surprised at her willingness. "Please ask Miss Lloyd if she knows what became of the 12th yellow rose, and beg her to appreciate the fact that it is a vital point in the case." Mrs. Pierce agreed to do this, and as I went down the stairs she promised to join me in the library a few moments later. She kept her promise, and I waited eagerly for her report. "Miss Lloyd bids me tell you," she said, "that she knows nothing of what you call the 12th rose. She did not count the roses. She merely took 2 of them to pin on her dress, and when she retired she carelessly threw those 2 in the waste basket. She thinks it probable that there were only 11 in the box when it arrived, but at any rate she knows nothing more of the matter." I thanked Mrs. Pierce for her courtesy and patience, and feeling that I now had a real problem to consider, I started back to the inn. It could not be that this rose matter was of no importance, for the florist had assured me that he had sold exactly 12 flowers to Mr. Gregory Hall, and of these I could account for only 11. The 12th rose must have been separated from the others, either by Mr. Hall at the time of purchase, or by someone else later. If the petals found on the floor fell from that 12th rose, and if Florence Lloyd spoke the truth when she declared she knew nothing of it, then she was free from suspicion in that direction. But until I could make some further effort to find out about the missing rose, I concluded to say nothing of it to anybody. I was not bound to tell Parmalee any points I might discover, for though colleagues, we were working independently of each other. But as I was anxious to gather any sidelights possible, I determined to go for a short conference with the district attorney, in whose hands the case had been put after the coroner's inquest. He was a man named Goodrich, a quiet-mannered, untalkative person, and as might be expected, he had made little or no progress as yet. He said nothing could be done until after the funeral and the reading of the will, which ceremonies would occur the next afternoon. I talked but little to Mr. Goodrich, yet I soon discovered that he strongly suspected Miss Lloyd of the crime, either as a principal or accessory. "But I can't believe it," I objected. "A girl delicately brought up in refined and luxurious surroundings does not deliberately commit an atrocious crime." "A woman thwarted in her love affair will do almost anything," declared Mr. Goodrich. "I have had more experience than you, my boy, and I advise you not to bank too much on the refined and luxurious surroundings. Sometimes such things foster crime instead of preventing it. But the truth will come out, and soon, I think. The evidence that seems to point to Miss Lloyd can be easily proved or disproved once we get at work in earnest. That coroner's jury was made up of men who were friends and neighbors of Mr. Crawford. They were so prejudiced by sympathy for Miss Lloyd and indignation at the unknown criminal that they couldn't give unbiased judgment. But we will yet see justice done. If Miss Lloyd is innocent, we can prove it. But remember the provocation she was under. Remember the opportunity she had to visit her uncle alone in his office, after every one else in the house was asleep. Remember that she had a motive, a strong motive, and no one else had." "Except Mr. Gregory Hall," I said meaningly. "Yes, I grant he had the same motive. But he is known to have left town at 6 that evening, and did not return until nearly noon the next day. That lets him out." "Yes, unless he came back at midnight, and then went back to the city again." "Nonsense," said Mr. Goodrich. "That's fanciful. Why, the latest train, the theatre train, as we call it, gets in at 1 o'clock, and is always full of our society people returning from the gaieties in New York. He would have been seen had he come on that train, and there is no later one." I didn't stay to discuss the matter further. Indeed, Mr. Goodrich had made me feel that my theories were fanciful. But whatever my theories might be, there were still a few facts to be investigated. Remembering my determination to examine that gold bag more thoroughly, I asked Mr. Goodrich to let me see it, for of course, as district attorney, it was now in his possession. He gave it to me with an approving nod. "That's the way to work," he said. "That bag is your evidence. Now, from that, you detectives must go ahead and learn the truth." "Whose bag is it?" I said, with the intention of drawing him out. "It's Miss Lloyd's bag," he said gravely. "Any woman in the world would deny its ownership in the existing circumstances, and I am not surprised that she did so, nor do I blame her for doing so. Self-preservation is a mighty strong impulse in the human heart, and we've all got a right to obey it." As I took the gold bag from his hand, I didn't in the least believe that Florence Lloyd was the owner of it, and I resolved anew to prove this to the satisfaction of everybody concerned. Mr. Goodrich turned away and busied himself with other matters, and I devoted myself to deep study. The contents of the bag proved as blank and unsuggestive as ever. The most exhaustive examination of its chain, its clasp, and its thousands of links gave me not the tiniest thread or shred of any sort. But as I poked and pried around in its lining, I found a card, which had slipped between the main lining and an inside pocket. I drew it out as carefully as I could, and it proved to be a small plain visiting card bearing the engraved name, Mrs. Egerton Purvis. I sat staring at it, and then furtively glanced at Mr. Goodrich. He was not observing me, and I instinctively felt that I did not wish him to know of the card until I myself had given the matter further thought. I returned the card to its hiding place, and returned the bag to Mr. Goodrich, after which I went away. I had not copied the name, for it was indelibly photographed upon my brain. As I walked along the street, I tried to construct the personality of Mrs. Egerton Purvis from her card. But I was able to make no rational deductions, except that the name sounded aristocratic, and was quite in keeping with the general effect of the bag and its contents. To be sure, I might have deduced that she was a lady of average height and size, because she wore a No. 6 glove, that she was careful of her personal appearance, because she possessed a vanity case, and that she was of tidy habits, because she evidently expected to send her gowns to be cleaned. But all these things seemed to me puerile and even ridiculous, as such characteristics would apply to thousands of women all over the country. Instead of this, I went straight to the telegraph office and wired to headquarters in a cipher code. I instructed them to learn the identity and whereabouts of Mrs. Egerton Purvis, and advise me as soon as possible. I then returned to the Sedgwick Arms, feeling decidedly well satisfied with my morning's work, and content to wait until after Mr. Crawford's funeral to do any further real work in the matter. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The will. I went to the Crawford house on the day of the funeral, but as I reached there, somewhat earlier than the hour appointed, I went into the office with the idea of looking about for further clues. In the office I found Gregory Hall, looking decidedly disturbed. "I can't find Mr. Crawford's will," he said, as he successively looked through one drawer after another. "What?" I responded. "Hasn't that been located already?" "No, it's this way. I didn't see it here in the office, or in the New York office, so I assumed Mr. Randolph had it in his possession. But it seems he thought it was here all the time. Only this morning we discovered our mutual error, and Mr. Randolph concluded it must be in Mr. Crawford's safety deposit box at the bank in New York. So Mr. Philip Crawford hurried through his administration papers. He is to be executor of the estate, and went in to get it from the bank. But he has just returned with the word that it wasn't there, so we've no idea where it is." "Oh, well," said I, "since he hadn't made the new will he had in mind, everything belongs to Miss Lloyd." "That's just the point," said Hall, his face taking on a despairing look. "If we don't find that will, she gets nothing." "How's that?" I asked. "Why, she's really not related to the Crawfords. She's a niece of Joseph Crawford's wife. So in the absence of a will, his property will all go to his brother Philip, who is his legal heir." "Oh!" I exclaimed. "This is a new development. But the will turn up?" "Oh, yes, I'm sure of it," returned Hall, but his anxious face showed anything but confidence in his own words. "But," I went on, "didn't Philip Crawford object to his brother's giving all his fortune to Miss Lloyd?" "It didn't matter if he did. Nobody could move Joseph Crawford's determination, and I fancy Philip didn't make any great disturbance about it. Of course Mr. Joseph had a right to do as he chose with his own, and the will gave Philip a nice little sum anyway. Not much, compared to the whole fortune, but still a generous bequest." "What does Mr. Randolph say?" "He's completely baffled. He doesn't know what to think." "Can it have been stolen?" "Why, no. Who would steal it? I only fear that he may have destroyed it because he expected to make a different one. In that case, Florence is penniless, save for such bounty as Philip Crawford chooses to bestow on her." I didn't like the tone in which Hall said this. It was distinctively aggrieved, and gave the impression that Florence Lloyd, penniless, was of far less importance than Miss Lloyd, the heiress of her uncle's millions. "But he would doubtless provide properly for her," I said. "Oh, yes, properly, but she would find herself in a very different position, dependent upon his generosity, from what she would be as sole heir to her uncle's fortune." I looked steadily at the man. Although not well acquainted with him, I couldn't resist giving expression to my thought. "But since you are to marry her," I said, "she need not long be dependent upon her uncle's charity." "Philip Crawford isn't really her uncle, and no one can say what he will do in the matter." Gregory Hall was evidently greatly disturbed at the new situation brought about by the disappearance of Mr. Crawford's will, but apparently the main reason for his disturbance was the impending poverty of his fiancée. There was no doubt that Mr. Carstairs and others who had called this man a fortune hunter had judged him rightly. However, without further words on the subject, I waited while Hall locked the door of the office, and then we went together to the great drawing room, where the funeral services were about to take place. I purposely selected a position from which I could see the faces of the group of people most nearly connected with the dead man. I had a strange feeling as I looked at them that one of them might be the instrument of the crime which had brought about this funeral occasion. During the services I looked closely and in turn at each face, but beyond the natural emotions of grief which might be expected, I could read nothing more. The brother Philip Crawford, the near neighbors, Mr. Porter and Mr. Hamilton, the lawyer Mr. Randolph, all sat looking grave and solemn as they heard the last words spoken above their dead friend. The ladies of the household, quietly controlling their emotions, sat near me, and next to Florence Lloyd, Gregory Hall had seated himself. All of these people I watched closely, half hoping that some inadvertent sign might tell me of someone's knowledge of the secret. But when the clergyman referred to the retribution that would sooner or later overtake the criminal, I could see an expression of fear or apprehension on no face save that of Florence Lloyd. She turned even whiter than before, her pale lips compressed in a straight line, and her small black-gloved hands softly crept into that of Gregory Hall. The movement was not generally noticeable, but it seemed to me pathetic above all things. Whatever her position in the matter, she was surely appealing to him for help and protection. Without directly repulsing her, Hall was far from responsive. He allowed her hand to rest in his own, but gave her no answering pressure, and looked distinctly relieved when, after a moment, she withdrew it. I saw that Parmalee also had observed this, and I could see that to him it was an indication of the girl's perturbed spirit. To me it seemed that it might equally well mean many other things. For instance, it might mean her apprehension for Gregory Hall, who, I couldn't help thinking, was far more likely to be a wrongdoer than the girl herself. With a little sigh, I gave up trying to glean much information from the present opportunity, and contented myself with the melancholy pleasure it gave me simply to look at the sad, sweet face of the girl who was already enshrined in my heart. After the solemn and rather elaborate obsequies were over, a little assembly gathered in the library to hear the reading of the will. As until then no one had known of the disappearance of the will except the lawyer and the secretary, it came as a thunderbolt. "I have no explanation to offer," said Mr. Randolph, looking greatly concerned, but free of all personal responsibility. "Mr. Crawford always kept the will in his own possession. When he came to see me the last evening he was alive, in regard to making a new will, he did not bring the old one with him. We arranged to meet in his office the next morning to draw up the new instrument, when he doubtless expected to destroy the old one. He may have destroyed it on his return home that evening, I do not know, but so far it has not been found among his papers in either of his offices or in the bank. Of course it may appear, as the search, though thorough, has not yet been exhaustive. We will, therefore, hold the matter in abeyance a few days, hoping to find the missing document." His hearers were variously affected by this news. Florence Lloyd was simply dazed. She could not seem to grasp a situation which so suddenly changed her prospects. For she knew well that the event of no will being found, Joseph Crawford's brother would be his rightful heir, and she would be legally entitled to nothing at all. Philip Crawford sat with an utterly expressionless face, quite able to control his emotion, if he felt any. He made no sign that he welcomed this possibility of great fortune unexpectedly coming to him. Lemuel Porter, who, with his wife, had remained because of their close friendship with the family, spoke out rather abruptly. "Find it? Of course it must be found. It's absurd to think that the man destroyed one will before the other was drawn." "I agree with you," said Philip Crawford. "Joseph was very methodical in his habits, and besides, I doubt if he would really have changed his will. I think he merely threatened it to see if Florence persisted in keeping her engagement." This was a generous speech on the part of Philip Crawford, to be sure. Generosity of speech couldn't affect the disposal of the estate. If no will were found, it must, by law, go to the brother. But none the less, the hearty, whole-souled way in which he spoke of Miss Lloyd was greatly to his credit as a man. "I think so, too," agreed Mr. Porter. "As you know, I called on Mr. Joseph Crawford during the last evening of his life." The speaker paused, and indeed it must have been a sad remembrance that pictured itself in his mind. "Did he then refer to the matter of the will?" asked Mr. Randolph, in gentle tones. "He did. Little was said on the subject, but he told me that unless Florence consented to his wishes in the matter of her engagement to Mr. Hall, he would make a new will, leaving her only a small bequest." "In what manner did you respond, Mr. Porter?" "I didn't presume to advise him definitely, but I urged him not to be too hard on the girl, and at any rate not to make a new will until he had thought it over more deliberately." "What did he then say?" "Nothing of any definite import. He began talking of other matters, and the will was not again referred to. But I can't help thinking he had not destroyed it." At this, Miss Lloyd seemed about to speak, but glancing at Gregory Hall, she gave a little sigh and remained silent. "You know of nothing that can throw any light on the matter of the will, Mr. Hall?" asked Mr. Randolph. "No, sir. Of course this whole situation is very embarrassing for me. I can only say that I have known for a long time the terms of Mr. Crawford's existing will. I have known of his threats of changing it. I have known of his attitude toward my engagement to his niece. But I never spoke to him on any of these subjects, nor he to me, though on several times I have thought that he was on the point of doing so. I have had access to most of his private papers, but of 2 or 3 small boxes he always retained the keys. I had no curiosity concerning the contents of these boxes, but I naturally assumed his will was in one of them. I have, however, opened these boxes since Mr. Crawford's death, in company with Mr. Randolph, and we found no will, nor could we discover any in the New York office or in the bank. That is all I know of the matter." Gregory Hall's demeanor was dignified and calm, his voice even and indeed cold. He was like a bystander with no vital interest in the subject he talked about. Knowing as I did that his interest was vital, I came to the conclusion that he was a man of unusual self-control and an ability to mask his real feelings completely. Feeling that nothing more could be learned at the present, I left the group in the library discussing the loss of the will, and went down to the district attorney's office. He was, of course, surprised at my news, and agreed with me that it gave us new fields for conjecture. "Now we see," he said eagerly, "that the motive for the murder was the theft of the will." "Not necessarily," I replied. "Mr. Crawford may have destroyed the will before he met his death." "But that would leave no motive." "No, the will supplies the motive. Now, you see, this frees Miss Lloyd from suspicion. She would have no reason to kill her uncle and then destroy or suppress a will in her own favor." "That reasoning also frees Mr. Hall from suspicion," said I, reverting to my former theories. "Yes, it does. We must look for the one who has benefited by the removal of the will. That, of course, would be the brother, Mr. Philip Crawford." I looked at the attorney a moment and then burst into laughter. "My dear Mr. Goodrich," I said, "don't be absurd. A man would hardly shoot his own brother, but aside from that, why should Philip Crawford kill Joseph just at the moment he is about to make a new will in Philip's favor? Either the destruction of the old will or the drawing of the new would result in Philip's falling heir to the fortune. So he would hardly precipitate matters by a criminal act. And, too, if he had been keen about the money, he could have urged his brother to disinherit Florence Lloyd, and Joseph would have willingly done so. He was on the very point of doing so anyway." "That's true," said Mr. Goodrich, looking chagrined but unconvinced. "However, it frees Miss Lloyd from all doubts by removing her motive. As you say, she wouldn't suppress a will in her favor and thereby turn the fortune over to Philip. And, as you also said, this lets Gregory Hall out, too, though I never suspected him for a moment. But of course his interests and Miss Lloyd's are identical." "Wait a moment," I said, for new thoughts were rapidly following one another through my brain. "Not so fast, Mr. District Attorney. The disappearance of the will does not remove motive from the possibility of Miss Lloyd's complicity in this crime, or Mr. Hall's either." "How so?" "Because if Florence Lloyd thought her uncle was in possession of that will, her motive was identically the same as if he had possessed it. Now, she certainly thought he had it, for her surprise at the news of its loss was as unfeigned as my own. And of course Hall thought the will was among Mr. Crawford's effects, for he has been searching constantly since the question was raised." "But I thought that yesterday you said you were sure of Miss Lloyd's innocence," objected Mr. Goodrich. "I was," I said slowly, "and I think I am still. But in the light of absolute evidence, I am only declaring that the non-appearance of that will in no way interferes with the motive Miss Lloyd must have had if she is in any way guilty. She knew, or thought she knew, that the will was there in her favor. She knew her uncle intended to revoke it and make another in her disfavor. I do not accuse her. I am not sure I suspect her. I only say that she had motive and opportunity." As I walked away from Mr. Goodrich's office, those words rang in my mind, motive and opportunity. Truly they applied to Mr. Hall as well as to Miss Lloyd, although of course it would mean Hall's coming out from the city and returning during the night. And though this might have been a difficult thing to do secretly, it was by no means impossible. He might not have come all the way to West Sedgwick Station, but might have dropped off the train earlier and taken the trolley. The trolley. That thought reminded me of the transfer I had picked up on the grass plot near the office veranda. Was it possible that slip of paper was a clue, and pointing toward Hall? Without definite hope of seeing Gregory Hall, but hopeful of learning something about him, I strolled back to the Crawford house. I went directly to the office, and by good luck found Gregory Hall there alone. He was still searching among the papers of Mr. Crawford's desk. "Ah, Mr. Burroughs," he said as I entered, "I'm glad to see you. If detectives detect, you have a fine chance here to do a bit of good work. I wouldn't mind offering you an honorarium myself, if you could unearth the will that has so mysteriously disappeared." Hall's whole manner had changed. He had laid aside entirely the grave demeanor which he had shown at the funeral, and was again the alert business man. He was more than this. He was eager, offensively so, in his search for the will. It needed no detective instinct to see that the fortune of Joseph Crawford and its bestowment were matters of vital interest to him. But though his personal feelings on the subject might be distasteful to me, it was certainly part of my duty to aid in the search, and so with him I looked through various drawers and filing cabinets. The papers representing or connected with the financial interests of the late millionaire were neatly filed and labeled, but in some parts of the desk we found the hodgepodge of personal odds and ends which accumulates with nearly everybody. Hall seemed little interested in those, but to my mind they showed a possibility of casting some light on Mr. Crawford's personal affairs. But among old letters, photographs, programs, newspaper clippings, and such things, there was nothing that seemed of the slightest interest, until at last I chanced upon a photograph that arrested my attention. "Do you know who this is?" I inquired. "No," returned Hall, with a careless glance at it. "A friend of Mr. Crawford's, I suppose." "More than a friend, I should judge," and I turned the back of the picture toward him. Across it was written, "With loving Christmas greetings from M.S.P.," and it was dated as recently as the Christmas previous. "Well," said Hall, "Mr. Crawford may have had a lady friend who cared enough about him to send an affectionate greeting, but I never heard of her before, and I doubt if she is any way responsible for the disappearance of this will." He went on searching through the desk, giving no serious heed to the photograph, but to me it seemed important. I alone knew of the visiting card in the gold bag. I alone knew that the bag belonged to a lady named Purvis. And here was a photograph initialed by a lady whose surname began with P, and who was unmistakably on affectionate terms with Mr. Crawford. To my mind, the links began to form a chain. The lady who had sent her photograph at Christmas, and who had left her gold bag in Mr. Crawford's office that night he was killed, surely was a lady to be questioned. But I had not yet had a reply to my telegram to the headquarters, so I said nothing to Hall on this subject, and putting the photograph in my pocket, continued to assist him to look for the will, but without success. However, the discovery of the photograph had, in a measure, diverted my suspicions from Gregory Hall, and though I endeavored to draw him into general conversation, I did not ask him any definite questions about himself. But the more I talked with him, the more I disliked him. He not only showed a mercenary, fortune-hunting spirit, but he showed himself in many ways devoid of the finer feelings and chivalrous nature that ought to belong to the man about to marry such a perfect flower of womanhood as Florence Lloyd. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Louis's story. After spending an evening in thinking over the situation and piecing together my clues, I decided that the next thing to be done was to trace up that transfer. If I could fasten that upon Gregory Hall, it would indeed be a starting point to work from. Although this seemed to eliminate Mrs. Purvis, who had already become a living entity in my mind, I still had haunting suspicions of Hall. And then, too, there was a possibility of collusion between these two. It might be fanciful, but if Hall and the Purvis woman were both implicated, Hall was quite enough a clever villain to treat the photograph lightly as he had done. And so the next morning I started for the office of the trolley car company. I learned without difficulty that the transfer I had found must have been given to some passenger the night of Mr. Crawford's death, but was not used. It had been issued after 9 o'clock in the evening, somewhere on the line between New York and West Sedgwick. It was a transfer which entitled a passenger on that line to a trip on that branch line running through West Sedgwick, and the fact that it had not been used implied either a negligent conductor or a decision on the part of the passenger not to take his intended ride. All this was plausible, though far from definite indication that Hall might have come out from New York by trolley, or part way by trolley, and though accepting a transfer on the West Sedgwick branch, had concluded not to use it. But the whole theory pointed equally as well to Mrs. Purvis, or indeed to the unknown intruder insisted upon by so many. I endeavored to learn something from the conductors who brought their cars into West Sedgwick late at night, but it seemed they carried a great many passengers, and of course could not identify a transfer, of which scores of duplicates had been issued. Without much hope, I interviewed the conductors of the West Sedgwick branch line. Though I could learn nothing definite, I fell into conversation with one of them, a young Irishman, who was interested because of my connection with the mystery. "No, sir," he said, "I can't tell you anything about a stray transfer, but one thing I can tell you, that their murder was committed of a Tuesday night, wasn't it?" "Yes," I returned. "Well, there's that parlez-vous valet of Mr. Crawford's. He rid on my car most every Tuesday night for weeks and weeks. It's his night off, and last Tuesday night he didn't ride with me. Now I don't know if that means anything, but again it might." It didn't seem to me that it meant much, for certainly Louis was not under the slightest suspicion. And yet, as I came to think about it, if that had been Louis's transfer, and if he had dropped it near the office veranda, he had lied when he said he went round the other side of the house to reach the back entrance. It was all very vague, but it narrowed itself down to the point that if that were Louis's transfer, it could be proved, and if not, it must be investigated further. For a trolley transfer, issued at a definite hour and dropped just outside the scene of the crime, was certainly a clue of importance. I proceeded to the Crawford house, and though I intended to have a talk with Louis later, I asked first for Miss Lloyd. Surely, if I were to carry on my investigation of the case in her interests, I must have a talk with her. I had not intruded before, but now that the funeral was over, the real work of tracking the criminal must be commenced, and, as one of the principal characters in the sad drama, Miss Lloyd must play her part. Until I found myself in her presence, I had not actually realized how much I wanted this interview. I was sure that what she said, her manner, and her facial expression must either blot out or strengthen whatever shreds of suspicion I held against her. "Miss Lloyd," I began, "I am, as you know, a detective, and I am here in Sedgwick for the purpose of discovering the cowardly assassin of your uncle. I assume that you wish to aid me in any way you can. Am I right in this?" Instead of the unhesitating affirmation I had expected, the girl spoke irresolutely. "Yes," she said, "but I fear I cannot help you, as I know nothing about it." The fact that this reply did not sound to me as a rebuff, for which it was doubtless intended, I can only account for by my growing appreciation of her wonderful beauty. Instead of funeral black, Miss Lloyd was clad in all white, and her simple wool gown gave her a statuesque appearance, which, however, was contradicted by the pathetic weariness in her face and the sad droop of her lovely mouth. Her helplessness appealed to me, and though she assumed an air of composure, I well knew it was only assumed, and that with some difficulty. Resolving to make it as easy as possible for her, I did not ask her to repeat the main facts which I already knew. "Then, Miss Lloyd," I said, in response to her disclaimer, "if you cannot help me, perhaps I can help you. I have reason to think that possibly Louis, your late uncle's valet, did not tell the truth in his testimony at the coroner's inquest. I have reason to think that instead of going around the house to the back entrance as he described, he went around the other side, thus passing your uncle's office." To my surprise, this information affected Miss Lloyd much more seriously than I supposed it would. "What?" she said, and her voice was a frightened whisper. "What time did he come home?" "I don't know," I replied, "but you surely don't suspect Louis of anything wrong. I was merely hoping that if he did pass the office, he might have looked in, and so could tell us of your uncle's well-being at that time." "At what time?" "At whatever time he returned home, presumably rather late. But since you are interested in the matter, will you not call Louis and let us question him together?" The girl fairly shuddered at this suggestion. She hesitated, and for a moment was unable to speak. Of course, this behavior on her part filled my soul with awful apprehension. Could it be possible that she and Louis were in collusion, and that she dreaded the Frenchman's disclosures? I remembered the strange looks he had cast at her while being questioned by the coroner. I remembered his vehement denial of having passed the office that evening. Too vehement, it now seemed to me. However, if I were to learn anything damaging to Florence Lloyd's integrity, I would rather learn it now in her presence than elsewhere. So again I asked her to send for the valet. With a despairing look, as of one forced to meet an impending fate, she rose, crossed the room, and rang a bell. Then she returned to her seat and said quietly, "You may ask the man such questions as you wish, Mr. Burroughs, but I beg you will not include me in the conversation." "Not unless it should be necessary," I replied coldly, for I did not at all like her making this stipulation. To me it savored of a sort of cowardice, or at least a presumption on my own chivalry. When the man appeared, I saw at a glance he was quite as much agitated as Miss Lloyd. There was no longer a possibility of doubt that these two knew something, and had some secret in common which bore directly on the case, and which must be exposed. A sudden hope flashed into my mind that it might be only some trifling secret, which seemed of importance to them, but which was merely a side issue of the great question. I considered myself justified in taking advantage of the man's perturbation, and without preliminary speech I drew the transfer from my pocket and fairly flashed it in his face. "Louis," I said sternly, "you dropped this transfer when you came home the night of Mr. Crawford's death." The suddenness of my remark had the effect I desired, and fairly frightened the truth out of the man. Yes, sir," he stammered, and then, with a frightened glance at Miss Lloyd, he stood nervously interlacing his fingers. I glanced at Miss Lloyd myself, but she had regained her entire self-possession, and sat looking straight before her with an air that seemed to say, "Go on, I'm prepared for the worst." As I paused myself to contemplate the attitudes of the two, I lost my ground of vantage. For when I again spoke to the man, he too was more composed and ready to reply with caution. Doubtless he was influenced by Miss Lloyd's demeanor, for he imitatively assumed a receptive air. "Where did you get the transfer?" I went on. "On the trolley, sir, the main line." "To be used on the branch line through West Sedgwick?" "Yes, sir." "Why did you not use it?" "As I tell you, sir, and as I tell monsieur the coroner, I have spent the evening with a young lady. We went for a trolley ride, and as we returned I took a transfer for myself, but not for her, as she lived near where we alight." "Oh, you left the main line and took the young lady home, intending then yourself to come by trolley through West Sedgwick?" "Yes, sir, it was just that way." At this point Louis seemed to forget his embarrassment. His gaze strayed away, and a happy expression came into his eyes. I felt sure I was reading his volatile French nature aright, when I assumed his mind had turned back to the pleasant evening he had spent with his young lady acquaintance. Somehow this went far to convince me of the fellow's innocence, for it was quite evident that murder and its mystery were not uppermost in his thoughts at that moment. But my next question brought him back to realization of the present situation. "And why didn't you use your transfer?" "Only that the night was so pleasant I desired to walk." "And so you walked through the village, holding perhaps the transfer in your hand?" "I think yes, but I do not remember the transfer in my hand, though he may have been there." And now the man's unquiet had returned. His lips twitched, and his dark eyes rolled about as he endeavored in vain to look anywhere but at Miss Lloyd. She too was controlling herself by a visible effort. Anxious to bring the matter to a crisis, I said at once and directly, "And then you entered the gates of this place? You walked to the house? You walked around the house to the back by way of the path which leads around by the library veranda, and you accidentally dropped your transfer near the veranda step?" I spoke quietly enough, but Louis immediately burst into voluble denial. "No, no!" he exclaimed. "I do not go round by the office. I go the other side of the house. I have tell you so many times." "But I myself picked up your transfer near the office veranda." "Then he blow there. The wind blow that night, oh, something fearful. He blow the paper around the house, I think." "I don't think so," I retorted. "I think you went around the house that way. I think you paused at the office window." Just here I made a dramatic pause myself, hoping thus to appeal to the emotional nature of my victim. And I succeeded. Louis almost shrieked as he pressed his hands against his eyes and cried out, "No, no, I tell you, I do not go round that way. I go round the other way, and the wind, he blow my transfer all about." I tried a more quiet manner. I tried persuasive arguments. I finally resorted to severity and even threats. But no admission could I get from Louis, except that he had not gone round the house by way of the office. I was positive that the man was lying, and I was equally positive that Miss Lloyd knew that he was lying, and that she knew why, but the matter seemed to me at a deadlock. I could have questioned her, but I preferred to do that when Louis was not present. If she must suffer ignominy, it need not be before a servant. So I dismissed Louis, perhaps rather curtly, and turning to Miss Lloyd, I asked her if she believed his assertion that he did not pass by the office that night. "I don't know what to believe," she answered, wearily, drawing her hand across her brow. "And I can't see that it matters anyway. Supposing he did go by the office, you certainly don't suspect him of my uncle's murder, do you?" "It is my duty, Miss Lloyd," I said gently, for the girl was pitiably nervous, "to get the testimony of any one who was in or near the office that night. But of course testimony is useless unless it is true." I looked her straight in the eyes as I said this, for I was thoroughly convinced that her own testimony at the inquest had not been entirely true. I think she understood my glance, for she arose at once and said with extreme dignity, "I cannot see any necessity for prolonging this interview, Mr. Burroughs. It is of course your work to discover the truth or falsity of Louis's story, but I cannot see that it in any way implicates or even interests me." The girl was superb. Her beauty was enhanced by the sudden spirit she showed, and her flashing dark eyes suggested a baited animal at bay. Apparently, she had reached the limit of her endurance, and was unwilling to be questioned further or drawn into further admissions. And yet, some inexplicable idea came to me that she was angry, not with me, but with the tangle in which I had remorselessly enmeshed her. Of a high order of intelligence, she knew perfectly well that I was conscious of the fact that there was a secret of some sort between her and the valet. Her haughty disdain, I felt sure, was to convey the impression that though there might be a secret between them, it was no collusion or working together, and that though her understanding with the man was mysterious, it was in no way beneath her dignity. Her imperious air, as she quietly left the room, thrilled me anew, and I began to think that a woman who could assume the haughty demeanor of an empress might have chosen, as empresses had done before her, to commit crime. However, she went away, and the dark and stately library seemed to have lost its only spot of light and charm. I sat for a few minutes pondering over it all, when I saw passing through the hall the maid Elsa. It suddenly occurred to me that having failed with the mistress of the house, I might succeed better with her maid, so I called the girl in. She came willingly enough, and though she seemed timid, she was not embarrassed or afraid. "I'm in authority here," I said, "and I'm going to ask you some questions, which you must answer truthfully." "Yes, sir," she said, without any show of interest. "Have you been with Miss Lloyd long?" "Yes, sir, about 4 years, sir." "Is she a kind mistress?" "Indeed she is, sir. She is the loveliest lady I ever worked for. I'd do anything for Miss Lloyd, that I would." "Well, perhaps you can best serve her by telling all you know about the events of Tuesday night." "But I don't know anything, sir," and Elsa's eyes opened wide in absolutely unfeigned wonderment. "Nothing about the actual murder? No, of course not. But I just want you to tell me a few things about some minor matters. Did you take the yellow flowers from the box that was sent to Miss Lloyd?" "Yes, sir. I always untie her parcels, and as she was at dinner, I arranged the flowers in a vase of water." "How many flowers were there?" For some reason, this simple query disturbed the girl greatly. She flushed scarlet, and then she turned pale. She twisted the corner of her apron in her nervous fingers, and then said, only half audibly, "I don't know, sir." "Oh, yes, you do, Elsa," I said in kindly tones, being anxious not to frighten her. "Tell me how many there were. Were there not a dozen?" "I don't know, sir. Truly I don't. I didn't count them all." It was impossible to disbelieve her. She was plainly telling the truth. And, too, why should she count the roses? The natural thing would be not to count them, but merely put them in the vase as she had said. And yet there was something about those flowers that Elsa knew and wouldn't tell. Could it be that I was on the track of that missing 12th rose? I knew, though perhaps Elsa did not, how many roses the florist had sent in that box, and unless Gregory Hall had abstracted one at the time of his purchase, the 12th rose had been taken by someone else after the flowers reached the Crawford house. Could it have been Elsa? And was her perturbation only because of a guilty conscience over a petty theft of a flower? But I realized I must question her adroitly, if I would find out these things. "Is Miss Lloyd fond of flowers?" I asked casually. "Oh, yes, sir. She always has some by her." "And do you love flowers too, Elsa?" "Yes, sir." But the quietly spoken answer, accompanied by a natural and straightforward look, promised little for my new theory. "Does Miss Lloyd sometimes give you some of her flowers?" "Oh, yes, sir, quite often." "That is, if she's there when they arrive. But if she isn't there, and you open the box yourself, she wouldn't mind if you took 1 or 2 blossoms, would she?" "Oh, no, sir, she wouldn't mind. Miss Lloyd's awfully kind about such things. but I wouldn't often do it, sir." "No, of course not. But you did happen to take one of these yellow roses, didn't you, though?" I breathlessly awaited the answer, but to my surprise, instead of embarrassment, the girl's eyes flashed with anger, though she answered quietly enough, "Well, yes, I did, sir." At last I was on the trail of that 12th rose, but from the frank way in which the girl admitted having taken the flower, I greatly feared that the trail would lead to a commonplace ending. "What did you do with it?" I said quietly, endeavoring to make the question sound of little importance. "I don't want to tell you." And the pout on her scarlet lips seemed more like that of a wilful child than one guarding a guilty secret. "Oh, yes, tell me, Elsa," and I even descended to a coaxing tone to win the girl's confidence. "Well, I gave it to that Louis." "To Louis? And why do you call him that Louis?" "Oh, because I gave him the flower to wear, because I thought he was going to take me out that evening. He had promised me he would. At least, he had sort of promised, and then and then he took another young lady," I finished for her, in tones of such sympathy and indignation that she seemed to think she had found a friend. "Yes," she said, "he went and took another girl riding on a trolley after he said he would take me." "Elsa," I said suddenly, and I fear she thought I had lost interest in her broken heart, "did Louis wear that rose you gave him that night?" "Yes, the horrid man! I saw it in his coat when he went away." "And did he wear it home again?" "How should I know?" Elsa tossed her head with what was meant to be a haughty air, but which was belied by the blush that mantled her cheek at her own prevarication. "But you do know," I insisted gently. "Did he wear it when he came home?" "Yes, he did." "How do you know?" "Because I looked in his room the next day, and I saw it there, all withered. He had thrown it on the floor." The tragedy in Elsa's eyes at this awful relation of the cruelty of the sterner sex called for a spoken sympathy, and I said at once and heartily, "That was horrid of him. If I were you, I'd never give him another flower." In accordance with the natural impulses of her sex, Elsa seemed pleased at my disapproval of Louis's behavior, but she by no means looked as if she would never again bestow her favor upon him. She smiled and tossed her head, and seemed willing enough for further conversation. But for the moment I felt that I had had enough food for thought. So I dismissed Elsa, having first admonished her not to repeat our conversation to anyone. In order to make sure that I should be obeyed in this matter, I threatened her with some unknown terrors which the law would bring upon her if she disobeyed me. When I felt sure she was thoroughly frightened into secrecy concerning our interview, I sent her away and began to cogitate on what she had told me. If Louis had come to the house late that night, as if by his own admission he did, if he went around the house on the side of the office, as the strain transfer seemed to me to prove, and if at the time he was wearing in his coat a yellow rose with petals similar to those found on the office floor the next morning, was not one justified in looking more deeply into the record of Louis the valet? End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Louis's confession. Elsa had been gone but a few moments when Florence Lloyd returned to the library. I arose to greet her and marveled at the change which had come over her. Surely here was a girl of 1,000 moods. She had left me with an effect of hauteur and disdain. She returned, gentle and charming, almost humble. I could not understand it, and remained standing after she had seated herself, awaiting developments. "Sit down, Mr. Burroughs," she said, and her low, sweet voice seemed full of cordial invitation. "I'm afraid I was rude to you when I went away just now, and I want to say that if I can tell you anything you wish to know, I should be glad to do so." I drew up a chair and seated myself near her. My heart was pounding with excitement at this new phase of the girl's nature. For an instant it seemed as if she must have a personal, kindly feeling towards me. And then my reason returned, and with a suddenly falling heart and slowing pulse, I realized that I was a fool, and that after thinking over the disclosures Louis had made, Miss Lloyd had shrewdly concluded it was to her best advantage to curry favor with the detective. This knowledge came to me instinctively, and so I distrusted her gentle voice and winning smile, and hardening my heart against her, I resolved to turn this new mood of hers to my own advantage, and learn what I could while she was willing to converse. "I am glad of this opportunity, Miss Lloyd," I said, "for there are some phases of this affair that I want to discuss with you alone. Let us talk the matter over quietly. It is as well that you should know that there are some doubts felt as to the entire truth of the story you told at the inquest. I do not say this to frighten you," I added, as the poor girl clasped her hands and gave me a look of dumb alarm. "But since it is so, I want to do all I can to set the matter right. Do you remember exactly all that took place, to your knowledge, on the night of your uncle's death?" "Yes," she replied, looking more frightened still. It was evident that she knew more than she had yet revealed. But I almost forgot my inquiry, so absorbed was I in watching her lovely face. It was even more exquisite in its terrified pallor than when the fleeting pink showed in her cheeks. "Then," I said, "let us go over it. You heard your uncle go out at about 8 o'clock and return about 9?" "Yes, I heard the front door open and close both times." "You and Mrs. Pierce being in the music room, of course. Then later you heard a visitor enter, and again you heard him leave?" "Yes, Mr. Porter." "Did you know it was Mr. Porter at the time he was here?" "No, I think not. I didn't think at all who it might be. Uncle Joseph often had men to call in the evening." "About what time did Mr. Porter leave?" "A few minutes before 10. I heard Lambert say, 'Good night, sir,' as he closed the door after him." "And soon after, you and Mrs. Pierce went upstairs?" "Yes, only a few minutes after." "And later Mrs. Pierce came to your room?" "Yes, about 10:30, I should say. She came to get a book. She didn't stay 2 minutes." "And after that you went downstairs again to speak to your uncle?" For the merest instant Miss Lloyd's eyes closed and she swayed as if about to faint, but she regained her composure at once, and answered with some asperity: "I did not. I have told you that I did not leave my room again that night." Her dark eyes blazed, her cheeks flushed, and though her full lower lip quivered, it was with anger now, not fear. As I watched her, I wondered how I could have thought her more beautiful when pale. Surely, with this glowing color, she was at her glorious best. "Then when did you drop the 2 rose petals there?" I went on, calmly enough, though my own heart was beating fast. "I did not drop them. They were left there by some intruder." "But, Miss Lloyd," and I observed her closely, "the petals were from a rose such as those Mr. Hall sent you that evening. The florist assured me there were no more such blossoms in West Sedgwick at the time. The falling petals, then, were from one of your own roses, or—" "Or?" asked Miss Lloyd, her hands pressed against the laces at her throbbing bosom. "Or—" "Or," I went on, "from a rose worn by some one who had come out from New York on a late train." For a moment I chose to ignore Louise's rose, for I wanted to learn anything Miss Lloyd could tell me. And, too, the yellow petals might have fallen from a flower in Hall's coat after all. I thought it possible by suggesting this idea to surprise from her some hint as to whether she had any suspicion of him. She gave a gasp, and leaning back in her chair, she closed her eyes as if spent with a useless struggle. "Wait a moment," she said, putting out her hand with an imploring gesture. "Wait a moment. Let me think. I will tell you all, but wait." With her eyes still closed, she lay back against the satin chair cushion, and I gazed at her, fascinated. I knew it. Then and there the knowledge came to me. Not her guilt, not her innocence. The crime seemed far away then, but I knew like a flash not only that I loved this girl, this Florence Lloyd, but that I should never love anyone else. It mattered not that she was betrothed to another man. The love that had suddenly sprung to my life and my heart was such pure devotion that it asked no return. Guilty or innocent, I loved her. Guilty or innocent, I would clear her, and if the desire of her heart were toward another, she should ever know or suspect my adoration for her. I gazed at her lovely face, knowing that when her eyes opened, I must discreetly turn my glance aside, but blessing every instant of opportunity thus given me. Her countenance, though troubled and drawn with anxiety, was so pure and sweet that I felt sure of her innocence. But it should be my work to prove that to the world. Suddenly her eyes flashed open, and again her mood had changed. "Mr. Burroughs," she said, and there was almost a challenge in her tone, "why do you ask me these things? You are a detective. You are here to find out for yourself, not to ask others to find out. I am innocent of my uncle's death, of course, but when you cast suspicion on the man to whom I am betrothed, you cannot expect me to help you confirm that suspicion. You have made me think by your remark about a man on a late train that you refer to Mr. Hall. Do you?" This was a change of base, indeed. I was being questioned instead of doing the catechizing myself. Very well, if it were my lady's will to challenge me, I would meet her on her own ground. "You took the hint very quickly," I said. "Had you thought of such a possibility before?" "No, nor do I now. I will not." Again she was the offended queen. "But since you have breathed the suggestion, you may not count on any help from me." "Could you have helped me otherwise?" I said, detaining her as she swept by. To this she made no answer, but again her face wore a troubled expression, and as she went slowly from the room, she left me with a strong conviction that she knew far more about Gregory Hall's connection with the matter than she had told me. I sat alone for a few moments, wondering what I had better do next. I had about decided to go in search of Parmalee and talk things over with him, but I thought it would be better to see Louis first and settle up the matter of his rose more definitely. Accordingly, I rang the bell, and when the parlor maid answered, I asked her to send both Louis and Elsa to me in the library. I could see at once that these two were not friendly towards each other, and I hoped this fact would aid me in learning the truth from them. "Now, Louis," I began, "you may as well tell me the truth about your homecoming last Tuesday night. In the first place, you must admit that you were wearing in your coat one of the yellow roses which had been sent to Miss Lloyd." "No, no, indeed," declared Louis, giving Elsa a threatening glance, as if forbidding her to contradict him. "Nonsense, man," I said. "Don't stand there and tell useless lies. It will not help you. The best thing you can do for yourself and for all concerned is to tell the truth. And, moreover, if you don't tell it to me now, you will have to tell it to Mr. Goodrich later. Elsa gave you a yellow rose, and you wore it away that evening when you went to see your young lady. Now, what became of that rose?" I lost it, sir." "No, you didn't lose it. You wore it home again, and when you retired, you threw it on the floor in your own room." "No, sir, you make mistake. I looked for him next day in my room, but cannot find him." I almost laughed at the man's ingenuousness. He contradicted his own story so unconsciously that I began to think he was more of a simpleton than a villain. "Of course you couldn't find it," I informed him, "for it was taken from your room next day, and of course you didn't look for it until after you had heard yellow roses discussed at the inquest." Louis's easily read face proved my statement correct, but he glowered at Elsa as he said, "Who take 'em away? Who take my rose from my room?" "But you denied having a rose, Louis. Now you're asking who took it away. Once again, let me advise you to tell the truth. You are not at all successful in telling falsehoods. Now answer me this. When you came home Tuesday night, did you or did you not walk around the house past the office window?" "No, sir. I walked around the other side. I—" "Stop, Louis. You are not telling the truth. You did walk around by the office, and you dropped your transfer there. It never blew all around the house, as you have said it did." A look of dogged obstinacy came into the man's eyes, but he did not look at me. He shifted his gaze uneasily as he repeated almost in a sing-song way, Go round the other side of the house." It was a sort of deadlock. Without a witness to the fact, I could not prove that he had gone by the office windows, though I was sure he had. But help came from an unexpected quarter. Elsa had been very quiet during the foregoing conversation, but now she spoke up suddenly and said, "He did go round by the office, Mr. Burroughs, and I saw him." I half expected to see Louis turn on the girl in a rage, but the effect of her speech on him was quite the reverse. He almost collapsed. He trembled and turned white, and though he tried to speak, he made no sound. Surely this man was too cowardly for a criminal, but I must learn the secret of his knowledge. "Tell me about it, Elsa," I said quietly. "I was looking out at my window, sir, at the back of the house, and I saw Louis come around the house, and he came around by the office side." "You are positive of this, Elsa? You would swear to it? Remember, you are making an important assertion." "I am telling the truth, sir. I saw him plainly as he came around and entered at the back door." "You hear, Louis," I said sternly. "I believe Elsa's statement rather than yours, for she tells a straight story, while you are rattled and agitated and have all the appearance of concealing something." Louis looked helpless. He did not dare deny Elsa's story, but he would not confirm it. At last he said, with a glance of hatred at the girl, "Elsa, she tell that story to make the trouble for me." There was something in this. Elsa, I knew, was jealous, and her pride had been hurt because Louis had taken the rose she had given him and then had gone to call on another girl. But I had no reason to doubt Elsa's statement, and I had every reason to doubt Louis'. I tried to imagine what Louis' experience had really been, and it suddenly occurred to me that though innocent himself of real wrong, he had seen something in the office or through the office windows that he wished to keep secret. I did not for a moment believe that the man had killed his master, so I concluded he was endeavoring to shield someone else. "Louis," I said suddenly, "I'll tell you what you did. You went around by the office. You saw a light there late at night, and you naturally looked in. You saw Mr. Crawford there, and he was perhaps already killed. You stepped inside and discovered this, and then you came away and said nothing about it, lest you yourself be suspected of the crime. Incidentally, you dropped 2 petals from the rose Elsa had given you." Louis' answer to this accusation was a perfect storm of denials, expressed in voluble French and broken English, but all to the effect that it was not true, and that if he had seen his master dead, he would have raised an alarm. I saw that I had not yet struck the right idea, so I tried again. "Then, Louis, you must have passed the office before Mr. Crawford was killed, which is really more probable. Then, as you passed the window, you saw something or someone in the office, and you were not willing to tell about it. Is that it?" This again brought forth only incoherent denial, and I could see that the man was becoming so rattled it was difficult for him to speak clearly, had he so desired to do so. "Elsa," I said suddenly, "you took that rose from Louis' room. What did you do with it?" "I I don't know what I did with it," stammered the girl, blushing rosy red, and looking shyly at Louis. I felt sorry to disclose the poor girl's little romance, for it was easy enough to see that she was in love with the fickle Frenchman, who evidently did not reciprocate her interest. He looked at her disdainfully, and she presented a pathetic picture of embarrassment. But the situation was too serious for me to consider Elsa's sentiments, and I said rather sternly, "You do know where it is. You preserve that rose as a souvenir. Go at once and fetch it." It was a chance shot, for I was not at all certain that she had kept the withered flower, but dominated by my superior will, she went away at once. She returned in a moment with the flower. Although withered, it was still in fairly good condition, quite enough so for me to see at a glance that no petals had been detached from it. The green calyx leaves clung around the bud in such a manner as to prove positively that the unfolding flower had lost no petal. This settled the 12th rose. Wherever those telltale petals had come from, they were not from Louis' rose. I gave the flower back to Elsa, and I said, "Take your flower, my girl, and go away now. I don't want to question you any more for the present." A little bewildered at her sudden dismissal, Elsa went away, and I turned my attention to the Frenchman. "Louis," I began, "this must be settled here and now between us. Either you must tell me what I want to know, or you must be taken before the district attorney and be made to tell him. I have proved to my own satisfaction that the rose petals in the office were not from the flower you wore. Therefore, I conclude that you did not go into the office that night, but as you passed the window you did see someone in there with Mr. Crawford. The hour was later than Mr. Porter's visit, for he had already gone home, and Lambert had locked the front door and gone to bed. You came in later, and what you saw or whom you saw through the office window so surprised you or interested you that you paused to look in, and there you dropped your transfer." Though Louis didn't speak, I could see at once that I was on the right track at last. The man was shielding somebody. He was unwilling to tell what he had seen, lest it inculpate someone. Could it be Gregory Hall? If Hall had come out on a late train and Louis had seen him in there, he might perhaps, under Hall's coercion, be keeping the fact secret. Again, if a strange woman with a gold bag had been in the office, that also would have attracted Louis's attention. Again, and here my heart almost stopped beating, could he have seen Florence Lloyd in there? But a second thought put me at ease again. Surely to have seen Florence in there would have been so usual and natural a sight that it could not have caused him anxiety. And yet again, for him to have seen Florence in her uncle's office would have proved to him that the story she told at the inquest was false. I must get out of him the knowledge he possessed, if I had to resort to some sort of third degree, but I might manage it by adroit questioning. "I quite understand, Louis, that you are shielding some person, but let me tell you that it is useless. It is much wiser for you to tell me all you know, and then I can go to work intelligently to find the man who murdered Mr. Crawford. You want me to find him, do you not?" Louis seemed to have found his voice again. "Yes, sir. Of course he must be found. Of course I want him found. The miscreant, the villain. But Mr. Burroughs, sir, what I have see in the office makes nothing to your search. I simply see Mr. Crawford alive and well, and as I pass by. That fool girl Elsa, she tell you that I pass by so I may say so, but I see nothing in the office to alarm me, and if I drop my transfer there, it is but because I think of him as of no consequence, and let him go." "Louis," and I looked him straight in the eye, "all that sounds straightforward and true, but if you saw nothing in the office to surprise or alarm you, why did you at first deny having passed by the office at all?" The man had no answer for this. He was not ingenious in inventing falsehood, and he stood there looking helpless and despairing. I perceived I should have to go on with my questioning. "Was it a man or a woman who you saw in there with Mr. Crawford?" "I see nobody, sir, nobody but my master." That wouldn't do. Then, as long as I asked him direct questions, he could answer falsely. I must trip him up in some roundabout way. "Yes," I said pleasantly, "I understand that. And what was Mr. Crawford doing?" "He sat at his desk," and Louis spoke slowly and picked his words with care. "Was he writing?" "No, that is, yes, sir, he was writing." I now knew he was not writing, for the truth had slipped out before the man could frame up his lie. I believed I was going to learn something at last, if I could make the man tell. Surely the testimony of one who saw Joseph Crawford late that night was of value, and though that testimony was difficult to obtain, it was well worth the effort. "And was Mr. Hall at his desk also?" Louis stared at me. "Mr. Hall, he was in New York that night." This was said so simply and unpremeditatedly that I was absolutely certain it was not Hall whom Louis had seen there. "Oh, yes, of course, so he was," I said lightly. "And Mr. Crawford was writing, was he?" "Yes, sir," spoken with the dog scowl which I was beginning to learn always accompanied Louis's untruthful statements. And now I decided to put my worst fear to the test and have it over with. It must be done, and I felt sure I could do it, but oh, how I dreaded it. "Did Mr. Crawford look up or see you?" "No, sir." "And didn't Miss Florence see you either?" "No, sir." It was out. The mere fact that Louis answered that question so calmly and unconsciously proved he was telling the truth. But what a truth, for it told me at the same time that Florence Lloyd was in the office with her uncle, that Louis had seen her, but she had not seen him. I had learned the truth from my reading of the man's expression and demeanor, and though it made my heart sink, I didn't for a moment doubt that it was the truth. Of course, Louis realized the next instant what he had done, and again he began his stammering denials. Of course, Miss Lloyd did not see me, for she is not there. How can she see me then? I tell you my master was alone. Had I been the least uncertain, this would have convinced me that I was right, for Louis's voice rose almost to a shriek, so angry was he with himself for having made the slip. "Give it up, Louis," I said. "You have let out the truth. Now be quiet. You couldn't help it, man. You were bound to trip yourself up sooner or later. You put up a good fight for Miss Florence, and now I understand why you told your falsehoods. I can't help admiring your chivalry. You saw Miss Lloyd there that evening. You heard her, next day at the inquest, deny having been in the office in the evening. So, in a way, it was very commendable on your part to avoid contradicting her testimonies with your own. But you are not clever enough, Louis, to carry out that deceit to the end. And now that you have admitted that you saw Miss Lloyd there, you can best help her cause and best help me to help her cause by telling me all about it. For rest assured, Louis, that I'm quite as anxious to prove Miss Lloyd's innocence as you can possibly be, and the only way to accomplish that end is to learn as much of the truth as I possibly can. Now, tell me what she was doing." "Only talking to her uncle, sir." Louis had the air of a defeated man. He had tried to shield Miss Lloyd's name and had failed. Now he spoke sullenly, and now as if his whole cause were lost. "Mr. Crawford was talking to her?" "Yes, sir." "He was not writing, then?" "No, sir." "Did they seem to be having an amicable conversation?" Louis hesitated, and his hesitation was sufficient answer. "Never mind," I said. "You need not tell me more. In fact, I would prefer to get the rest of the story from Miss Lloyd herself." Louis looked startled. "Don't tell Miss Lloyd I told you this," he begged. "I have tried very hard not to tell you." "I know you tried hard, Louis, not to tell me, and it was not your fault that I wrung the truth from you. I will not tell Miss Lloyd that you told me, unless it should become necessary, and I do not think it will. Go away now, Louis, and do not discuss this matter with anybody at all. And also, do not think for a moment that you have been disloyal in telling me that you saw Miss Lloyd. As I say, you couldn't help it. I simply should have kept at you until I made you tell, so you need not blame yourself in the matter at all." Louis went away, and though I could see that he believed what I said, he had a dejected air, and I couldn't help feeling sorry for the man who had so inadvertently given me the knowledge that must be used against the beautiful girl who had herself given untrue testimony. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Miss Lloyd's confidence. After Louis left me, I felt as if a dead weight had fallen on my heart. Florence Lloyd had gone down to her uncle's office late that night, and yet at the inquest she had testified that she had not done so. And even to me, when talking quietly and alone, she had repeated her false assertion. This much I knew, but why she had done it I did not know. Not until I was forced to do so would I believe that even her falsehood in the matter meant she herself was guilty. There must be some other reason for her mendacity. Well, I would find out this reason, and if it were not a creditable one to her, I would endeavor to do all I could for her. I longed to see her, and try if perhaps kind and gentle urging might not elicit the truth. But she had left me with such an air of haughty disdain, I hesitated to send for her again just now. As it was nearly dinner time, I resolved to go back to my hotel. On the way, I came to the conclusion that it would do no harm to have a talk with Parmalee. I had not much confidence in his detective ability, but he knew the people better than I did, and might be able to give me information of some sort. After I reached the Sedgwick Arms, I telephoned Parmalee to come over and dine with me, and he readily consented. During dinner I told him all that I had learned from Elsa and Louis. Of course, I had no right to keep this knowledge to myself, and, too, I wanted Parmalee's opinion on the situation as it stood at present. "It doesn't really surprise me," he said, "for I thought all along Miss Lloyd was not telling the truth. I'm not yet ready to say that I think she killed her uncle, although I must say it seems extremely probable. But if she didn't commit the deed, she knows perfectly well who did." "Meaning Hall?" "No, I don't mean Hall. In fact, I don't mean anyone in particular. I think Miss Lloyd was the instigator of the crime and practically carried out its commission. But she may have had an assisting agent for the actual deed." "Oh, how you talk! It quite gives me the shivers even to think of a beautiful young woman being capable of such thoughts or deeds. But you see, Burroughs, that's because you are prejudiced in favor of Miss Lloyd. Women are capable of crime as well as men, and sometimes they're even more clever in the perpetration of it. And you must admit if ever a woman was capable of crime, Miss Lloyd is of that type." "I have to agree to that, Parmalee," I admitted. "She certainly shows great strength of character." "She shows more than that. She has indomitable will, unflinching courage, and lots of pluck. If for any reason she made up her mind to kill a man, she'd find a way to do it." This talk made me cringe all over, but I couldn't deny it. For so far as I knew Florence Lloyd, Parmalee's words were quite true. "All right," I said. "I'll grant her capability, but that doesn't prove a thing. I don't believe that girl is guilty, and I hope to prove her innocence." "But look at the evidence, man. She denied her presence in the room, yet we now know she was there. She denied the ownership of the gold bag, yet probably she was also untruthful in that matter. She is a woman of a complex nature, and though I admire her in many ways, I shouldn't care to have much to do with her." "Let us leave out the personal note, Parmalee," I said, for I was angry at his attitude towards Florence. "All right. Don't you think for a moment that I don't see where you stand with regard to the haughty beauty, but that's neither here nor there." "Indeed it isn't," I returned, "and whatever may be my personal feelings towards Miss Lloyd, I can assure you it in no way influences my work on this case." "I believe you, old man, and so I'm sure you will agree with me that we must follow up the inquiry as to Miss Lloyd's presence in the office that night. She must be made to talk, and perhaps it would be best to tell Goodrich all about it, and let him push the matter." "Oh, no," I cried involuntarily. "Don't set him on the track of the poor girl. That is, Parmalee, let me talk to her again first. Now that I know she was down there that night, I think I can question her in a little different manner, and persuade her to own the truth. And, Parmalee, perhaps she was down there because Hall was there." "Hall? He was in New York." "So he says. But why should he speak the truth any more than Miss Lloyd?" "You mean they both may be implicated?" "Yes, or he may have used her as a tool." "Not Florence Lloyd. She's nobody's tool." "Any woman might be a tool at the command of the man she loves. But," I went on, with an air of conviction which was not entirely genuine, "Miss Lloyd doesn't love Mr. Hall." "I don't know about that," returned Parmalee. "You can't tell about a woman like Florence Lloyd. If she doesn't love him, she's at least putting up a bluff of doing so." "I believe it is a bluff, though I'm sure I don't know why she should do that." "On the other hand, why shouldn't she? For some reason she's dead set on marrying him, ready to give up her fortune to do so, if necessary. He must have some sort of pretty strong hold on her." "I'll admit all that, and yet I can't believe she loves him. He's such a commonplace man." "Commonplace doesn't quite describe him. And yet Gregory Hall, with all the money in the world, could never make himself distinguished or worth while in any way." "No. And what would Miss Florence Lloyd see in a man like that, to make her so determined to marry him?" "I don't think she's determined, except that Hall has some sort of hold over her, a promise or something that she can't escape." My heart rejoiced at the idea that Florence was not in love with Hall, but I did not allow myself to dwell on that point, for I was determined to go on with the work, irrespective of my feelings toward her. "You see," Parmalee went on, "you suspect Hall only because you're prejudiced against him." "Good gracious!" I exclaimed. "That's an awful thing to say, Parmalee. The idea of a detective suspecting a man merely because he doesn't admire him personally! And besides, it isn't true. If I suspect Hall, it's because I think he had a strong motive, a possible opportunity, and more than all, because he refuses to tell where he was Tuesday night." "But that's just the point, Burroughs. A man who will commit murder would fix up his alibi first of all. He would know that his refusal to tell us his whereabouts would be extremely suspicious. No, to my mind, it's Hall's refusal to tell that stamps him as innocent." "Then in that case, it's the cleverest kind of an alibi he could invent, for it stamps him innocent at once." "Oh, come now, that's going pretty far. But I will say, Burroughs, that you haven't the least shred of proof against Hall, and you know it. Prejudice and unfounded suspicion, and even a strong desire that he should be the villain, are all very well, but they won't go far as evidence in a court of law." I was forced to admit that Parmalee was right, and that so far I had no proof whatever that Gregory Hall was at all implicated in Mr. Crawford's death. To be sure, he might have worn a yellow rose, and he might have brought the late newspaper, but there was no evidence to connect him with those clues. And, too, there was the gold bag. It was highly improbable that that should have been brought to the office and left there by a man. However, I persuaded Parmalee to agree not to carry the matter to Mr. Goodrich until I had had one more interview with Miss Lloyd, and I promised to undertake that the next morning. After Parmalee had gone, I indulged in some very gloomy reflections. Everything seemed to point one way. Every proof, every suspicion, and every hint more or less implicated Miss Lloyd. But the more I realized this, the more I determined to do all I could for her, and as to do this, I must gain her confidence and even liking. I resolved to approach the subject the next day with the utmost tactfulness and kindliness, hoping by this means to induce the truth from her. The next morning I started on my mission with renewed hopefulness. Reaching the Crawford house, I asked for Miss Lloyd, and I was shown into a small parlor to wait for her. It was a sort of morning room, a pretty little apartment that I had not been in before, and it was so much more cheerful and pleasant than the stately library. I couldn't help hoping that Miss Lloyd, too, would prove more amenable than she had yet been. She soon came in, and though I was beginning to get accustomed to the fact that she was a creature of variable moods, I was unprepared for this one. Her hauteur had disappeared. She was apparently in a sweet and gentle frame of mind. Her large dark eyes were soft and gentle, and though her red lips quivered, it was not with anger or disdain as they had done the day before. She wore a plain white morning gown and a long black necklace of small beads. The simplicity of this costume suited her well, and threw into relief her own rich coloring and striking beauty. She greeted me more pleasantly than she had ever done before, and I couldn't help feeling that the cheerful, sunny little room had a better effect on her moods than the darker furnishings of the library. "I wish," I began, "that we had not to talk of anything unpleasant this morning. I wish there were no such things as untruth or crime in the world, and that I were calling on you as an acquaintance, as a friend might call." "I wish so, too," she responded, and as she flashed a glance at me, I had a glimpse of what it might mean to be friends with Florence Lloyd, without the ugly shadow between us that was now spoiling our tête-à-tête. Just that fleeting glance held in it the promise of all that was attractive, charming, and delightful in femininity. It was as if the veil of the great gloomy sorrow had been lifted for a moment, and she was again an untroubled, merry girl. It seemed, too, as if she wished that we could be together under pleasanter circumstances, and could converse on subjects of less dreadful import. However, all these thoughts that tumultuously raced through my mind must be thrust aside in favor of the business in hand. So though I hated to, I began at once. I am sorry, Miss Lloyd, to doubt your word, but I want to tell you myself, rather than have you learn it from others, that I have a witness who has testified to your presence in your uncle's office that fateful Tuesday night, although you have said you didn't go down there." As I had feared, the girl turned white and shivered as with a dreadful apprehension. "Who is the witness?" she said. I seemed to read her mind, and I felt at once that to her the importance of what I had said depended largely on my answer to this question, and I paused a moment to think what this could mean. And then it flashed across me that she was afraid I would say the witness was Gregory Hall. I became more and more convinced that she was shielding Hall, and I felt sure that when she learned it was not he, she would feel relieved. However, I had promised Louis not to let her know that he had told me of seeing her, unless it should be necessary. "I think I won't tell you that, but since you were seen in the office at about 11 o'clock, will you not tell me, I assure you it is for your own best interests, what you were doing there, and why you denied being there?" "First tell me the name of your informer," and so great was her agitation that she scarcely breathed the words. "I prefer not to do so, but I may say it is a reliable witness, and one who gave his evidence most unwillingly." "Well, if you will not tell me who he was, will you answer just one question about him? Was it Mr. Hall?" "No, it was not Mr. Hall." As I had anticipated, she showed distinctly her relief at my answer. Evidently, she dreaded to hear Hall's name brought into the conversation. "And now, Miss Lloyd, I ask you earnestly, and with the best intent, please tell me the details of your visit to Mr. Crawford that night in his office." She sat silent for a moment, her eyes cast down, the long dark lashes lying on her pale cheeks. I waited patiently, for I knew she was struggling with a strong emotion of some sort, and I feared if I hurried her, her gentle mood would disappear, and she might again become angry or haughty of demeanor. At last she spoke. The dark lashes slowly raised, and she seemed even more gentle than at first. "I must tell you," she said. "I see I must, but don't repeat it, unless it is necessary. Detectives have to know things, but they don't have to tell them, do they?" "We never repeat confidences, Mrs. Lloyd," I replied, "except when necessary to further the cause of right and justice." "Truly, is that so?" She brightened up so much that I began to hope she had only some trifling matter to tell of. "Well, then," she went on, "I will tell you, for I know it need not be repeated in the furtherance of justice. I did go down to my uncle's office that night, after Mrs. Pierce had been to my room, and it was it must have been I, who dropped those rose petals." "And left the bag?" I suggested. "No," she said, and her face looked perplexed but not confused. "No, the bag is not mine, and I did not leave it there. I know nothing of it, absolutely nothing. But I did go to the office at about 11 o'clock. I had a talk with my uncle. I left him there a half hour later, alive and well as when I went in." "Was your conversation about your engagement?" "Yes." "Was it amicable?" "No, it was not. Uncle Joseph was more angry than I had ever before seen him. He declared he intended to make a new will the next morning, which would provide only a small income for me. He said this was not revenge or punishment for my loyalty to Mr. Hall, but "But what?" I urged gently. "It scarcely seems loyal to Mr. Hall for me to say it," she returned, and the tears were in her eyes. "But this is all confidential. Well, Uncle Joseph said that Gregory only wanted to marry me for my fortune, and that the new will would prove this. Of course I denied that Mr. Hall was so mercenary. And then we had a good deal of an altercation, but it was not very different from many discussions we had had on the same subject. Only Uncle was more decided, and he said he had asked Mr. Randolph to come the next morning and draw up the new will. I left him still angry. He wouldn't even say good night to me, and now I blame myself for not being more gentle and trying harder to make peace. But it annoyed me to have him call Gregory mercenary." "Because you knew it was true," I said quietly. She turned white to the very lips. You are unnecessarily impertinent," she said. "I am," I agreed. "I beg your pardon. But I had discovered that she did realize her lover's true nature." "And then you went to your room and stayed there," I went on, with a meaning emphasis on the last clause. "Yes," she said. "And so you see, what I have told you casts no light on the mystery. I only told you so as to explain the bits of the yellow rose. I feared, from what you said, that Mr. Hall's name might possibly be brought into the discussion." "Why, he was not in West Sedgwick that night," I said. "Where was he?" she countered quickly. "I don't know. He refuses to tell. Of course you must see that his absolute refusal to tell where he was that night is, to say the least, an unwise proceeding." "He won't even tell me where he was," she said, sighing. "But it doesn't matter. He wasn't here." "That's just it," I rejoined. "If he was not here, it would be far better for him to tell where he really was. For the refusal to tell raises a question that will not be downed, except by an alibi. I don't want to be cruel, Miss Lloyd, but I must make you see that as the inquiry proceeds, the actions of both Mr. Hall and yourself will be subjected to very close scrutiny, and though perhaps undue attention will be paid to trifles, yet the trifles must be explained." I was so sorry for the girl that in my effort not to divulge my too great sympathy, I probably used a sterner tone than I realized. At any rate, I had awakened her at last to a sense of the danger that threatened her and her lover, and now, if she would let me, I would do all in my power to save them both. But I must know all she could tell me. "When did Mr. Hall leave you?" I asked. "You mean the day last Tuesday?" "Yes." "He left here about 5:30. He had been in the office with Uncle Joseph all the afternoon, and at 5 o'clock he came in here for a cup of tea with me. He almost always comes in at tea time. Then he left about 5:30, saying he was going to New York on the 6 o'clock train." "For what purpose?" "I never asked him questions like that. I knew he was to attend to some business for Uncle the next day, but I never asked him what he does evenings when he's in the city, or at any time when he is not with me." "But surely one might ask such questions of the man to whom she is betrothed." Miss Lloyd again put on that little air of hauteur which always effectually stopped my impertinence. "It is not my habit," she said. "What Gregory wishes me to know he tells me of his own accord." Chapter 14. Chapter 14 of The Gold Bag by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Porter's Views. I began on a new tack. "Miss Lloyd, why did you tell an untruth and say that you did not come downstairs again after going up at 10 o'clock?" Her hauteur disappeared. A frightened, appealing look came into her eyes, and she looked to me like a lovely child afraid of unseen dangers. "I was afraid," she confessed. "Yes, truly, I was afraid that they would think I had something to do with with Uncle Joseph's death. And as I didn't think it could do any good to tell of my little visit to him, I just said I didn't come down. Oh, I know it was a lie. I know it was wicked. But I was so frightened, and it was such an easy way out of it, just to deny it." "And why have you confessed it to me now?" Her eyes opened wide in astonishment. "I told you why," she said, "so you would know where the rose leaves came from, and not suspect Gregory." "Do you suspect him?" "No, of course not, but others might." It is impossible to describe the dismay that smote my heart at the hesitation of this answer. It was more than hesitation. It was a conflict of unspoken impulses, and the words, when they were uttered, seemed to carry hidden meanings. And to my mind they carried the worst and most sinister meaning conceivable. To me it seemed to point unmistakably to collusion between Florence Lloyd, whom I already loved, and Gregory Hall, whom I already distrusted and disliked. Guilty collusion between these two would explain everything. There's the motive, there's the opportunity, there's the denials and false witnessing. The gold bag as yet remained unexplained, but the yellow rose petals and the late newspaper could be accounted for if Hall had come out on the midnight train and Florence had helped him to enter and leave the house unseen. Bah, it was impossible. And, anyway, the gold bag remained as proof against this horrid theory. I would pin my faith to the gold bag, and through its presence in the room, I would defy suspicion of the two people I had resolved to protect. "What do you think about the gold bag?" I asked. "I don't know what to think. I hate to accuse Uncle Joseph of such a thing, but it seems as if some woman friend of his must have come to the office after I left. The long French windows were open. It was a warm night, you know, and anyone could have come and gone unseen." "The bag wasn't there when you were there?" "I'm sure it was not. That is, not in sight. And Uncle Joseph was not the sort of man to have such a thing put away in his desk as a souvenir, or for any other reason. Forgive the insinuation, but of course you could not know positively that Mr. Crawford would not have a feminine souvenir in his desk?" She looked up surprised. "Of course I could not be positive," she said, "but it is difficult to imagine anything sentimental connected with Uncle Joseph." She almost smiled as she said this, for apparently the mere idea was amusing, and I had a flashing glimpse of what it must be to see Florence Lloyd smile. Well, it should not be my fault, or due to my lack of exertion, if the day did not come when she should smile again, and I promised myself I should be there to see it. But stifling these thoughts, I brought my mind back to duty. Drawing from my pocket the photograph I had found in Mr. Crawford's desk, I showed it to her. "In Uncle's desk!" she exclaimed. "This does surprise me. I had no idea Uncle Joseph had received a photograph from a lady with an affectionate message, too. Are you quite sure it belonged to him?" "I only know that we found it in his desk, hidden beneath some old letters and papers." "Were the letters from this lady?" "No. In no case could we find a signature that agreed with these initials. Here's your chance, Mr. Burroughs," and again Florence Lloyd's dimples nearly escaped the bondage which held them during these sad days. "If you're a detective, you ought to gather at once from this photograph and signature all the details about this lady, who she is, and what she had to do with Uncle Joseph." "I wish I could do so," I replied, "but you see, I'm not that kind of detective. I have a friend, Mr. Stone, who could do it, and would tell you, as you say, everything about that lady, merely by looking at her picture. As case in point, I told her then and there the story of Fleming Stone's wonderful deductions from the pair of muddy shoes we had seen in a hotel one morning." "But you never proved that it was true?" she asked, her dark eyes sparkling with interest and her face alight with animation. "No, but it wasn't necessary. Stone's deductions are always right, and if not, you know it is the exception that proves the rule." "Well, let us try to deduce a little from this picture. I don't believe for a moment that Uncle Joseph had a romantic attachment for any lady, though these words on the back of the picture do seem to indicate it." "Well, go on," said I, so carried away by the fascination of the girl, when she had for a moment seemed to forget her troubles, that I wanted to prolong the moment. "Go ahead and see what inferences you can draw from the photograph." "I think she is about 50 years old," Florence began, "or perhaps 55. What do you think?" "I wouldn't presume to guess a lady's age," I returned, "and beside, I want you to try your powers on this. You may be better at deduction than I am. I have already confessed to you my inability in that direction." "Well," she went on, "I think this lady is rather good looking, and I think she appreciates the fact. The first is evident on the face of it, and the second is a universal truth. So you haven't really deduced much as yet." "No, that's so," and she pouted a little, "but at any rate, I can deduce more about her dress than you can. The picture was taken, or at least that costume was made, about a year ago, for that is the style that was worn then." "Marvelous, Holmes, marvelous." She flashed me a glance of understanding and appreciation, but undaunted went on. The gown also was not made by a competent modiste, but was made by a dressmaker in the house, who came in by the day. The lady is of an economical turn of mind, because the lace yoke of the gown is an old one, and has even been darned to make it presentable to use in the new gown. Now that is a deduction, I said admiringly. The only trouble is that it doesn't do us much good. Somehow I can't seem to fancy this good-looking, economical, middle-aged lady, who has her dressmaking done at home, coming here in the middle of the night and killing Mr. Crawford. No, I can't either, said Florence gravely. But then, I can't imagine anyone else doing that either. It seems like a horrible dream, and I can't realize that it really happened to Uncle Joseph. But it did happen, and we must find the guilty person. I think with you that this photograph is of little value as a clue, and yet it might turn out to be. And yet I do think the gold bag is a clue. You are quite sure it isn't yours? Perhaps it was a mean way to put the question, but the look of indignation she gave me helped convince me that the bag was not hers. I told you it was not, she said, but, and her eyes fell, since I have confessed to one falsehood, of course you cannot really believe my statement. But I do believe it, I said, and I did, thoroughly. At any rate, it is a sort of proof, she said, smiling sadly, that anyone who knows anything about women's fashions can tell you that it is not customary to carry a bag of that sort when one is in the house and in evening dress, or rather in a negligee costume, for I had taken off my evening gown and wore a tea gown. I should not think of going anywhere in a tea gown and carrying a gold bag. The girl had seemingly grown almost light-hearted. Her speech was punctuated with little smiles, and her half-sad, half-gay demeanor bewitched me. I felt sure that what little suggestion of light-heartedness had come into her mood had come because she had at last confessed the falsehood she had told, and her freed conscience gave her a little buoyancy of heart. But there were still important questions to be asked, and so, though unwillingly, I returned to the old subject. Did you see your uncle's will while you were there? No, he talked about it, but he did not show it to me. Did he talk about it as if it were still in his possession? Why, yes, I think so. That is, he said he would make a new one, unless I gave up Gregory. That implied the old one was still in existence, though he didn't exactly say so. Miss Lloyd, this is important evidence. I must tell you that I shall be obliged to repeat much of it to the district attorney. It seems to me to prove that your uncle did not himself destroy the will. He might have done so after I left him. I can't think it, for it is not in scraps in the wastebasket, nor are there any paper ashes in the grate. Well, then, she rejoined, if he didn't destroy it, it may yet be found. You wish that very much, I said, almost involuntarily. Oh, I do, she exclaimed, clasping her hands. Not so much for myself as... She paused, and I finished the sentence for her. For Mr. Hall. She looked angry again, but said nothing. Well, Miss Lloyd, I said as I rose to go, I am going to do everything in my power in your behalf and in behalf of Mr. Hall. But I tell you frankly, unless you will both tell me the truth and the whole truth, you will only defeat my efforts and work your own undoing. I had to look away from her as I said this, for I could not look on that sweet face and say anything even seemingly harsh or dictatorial. Her lip quivered. I will do my best, she said tremblingly. I will try to make Mr. Hall tell where he was that night. I will see you again after I have talked with him. More collusion. I said good-bye rather curtly, I fear, and went quickly away from that perilous presence. Truly a nice detective eye, bowled over by a fair face. I was unable to think clearly, to judge logically, or to work honestly. Well, I would go home and think it out by myself. Away from her influence, I surely would regain my cool-headed methods of thought. When I reached the inn, I found Mr. Lemuel Porter there waiting for me. "How do you do, Mr. Burroughs?" he said pleasantly. "Have you time for a half-hour's chat?" It was just what I wanted. A talk with this clear-thinking man would help me, indeed, and I determined to get his opinions, even as I was ready to give him mine. "Well, what do you think about it all?" I inquired, after we had comfortably settled at a small table on the shaded veranda, which was a popular gathering place at this hour. But in our corner we were in no danger from listening ears, and I awaited his reply with interest. His eyes smiled a little as he said, "You know the old story of the man who said he wouldn't hire a dog and then do his own barking? Well, though I haven't hired you, I would be quite ready to pay your honorarium if you can ferret out our West Sedgwick mystery. And so, as you are the detective in charge of the case, I ask you, what do you think about it all?" But I was pretty thoroughly on my guard now. "I think," I began, "that much hinges on the ownership of that gold bag." "And you do not think it is Miss Lloyd's?" "I do not." "It need not incriminate her if it were hers," said Mr. Porter meditatively, knocking the ash from his said cigar. "She might have left it in the office at any time previous to the day of the crime. Women are always leaving such things about. I confess it does not seem to me important." "Was it on Mr. Crawford's desk when you were there?" I asked suddenly. He looked up at me quickly, and again that half smile came into his eyes. "Am I to be questioned?" he said. "Well, I've no objections, I'm sure. No, I do not think it was there when I called on Mr. Crawford that evening, but I couldn't swear to this, for I am not an observant man, and the thing might have lain there in front of me and never caught my eye. If I had noticed it, of course I should have thought it was Florence's." "But you don't think so now, do you?" "No, I can't say I think so, and yet I can imagine a girl untruthfully denying ownership under such circumstances." I started at this, for hadn't Miss Lloyd untruthfully denied coming downstairs to talk to her uncle? "But," went on Mr. Porter, "if the bag is not Florence's, then I can think of but one explanation for its presence there." "A lady visitor late at night," I said slowly. "Yes," was the grave reply, "and though such an occurrence might have been an innocent one, yet taken in connection with the crime, there is a dreadful possibility." "Granting this," I suggested, "we ought to be able to trace the owner of the bag." "Not likely. If the owner of that bag, a woman presumably, is the slayer of Joseph Crawford and made her escape from the scene undiscovered, she is not likely to stay around where she may be found, and the bag itself and its contents are hopelessly unindividual." "They are that," I agreed. "Not a thing in it that mightn't be in any woman's bag in this country. To me, that cleaner's advertisement means nothing in connection with Miss Lloyd." "I'm glad to hear you say that, Mr. Burroughs. I confess I have had half a fear that your suspicion had a trend in Florence's direction, and I assure you, sir, that the girl is incapable of the slightest impulse toward crime." "I'm sure of that," I said heartily, my blood bounding in my veins at an opportunity to speak in defense of the woman I loved. "But how if her impulses were directed or even coerced by another?" "Just what do you mean by that?" "Oh, nothing. But sometimes the best and sweetest women will act against their own good impulses for those they love." "I cannot pretend to misunderstand you," said Mr. Porter, "but you are wrong. If the one you have in mind, I will say no name, was in any way guiltily implicated, it was without the knowledge or connivance of Florence Lloyd. But, man, the idea is absurd. The individual in question has a perfect alibi." "He refuses to give it." "Refuses the details, perhaps, and he has a right to, since they concern no one but himself. No, my friend, you know the French rule. Well, follow that, and search for the lady with the gold mesh bag." "The lady without it at present," I said, with an apologetic smile for my rather grim jest. "Yes, and that's the difficulty. As she hasn't the bag, we can't discover her, so as a clue it is worthless." "It seems to be," I agreed. I thought best not to tell Mr. Porter of the card I had found in the bag, for I hoped soon to hear from headquarters concerning the lady whose name it bore. But I told him about the photograph I had found in Mr. Crawford's desk, and showed it to him. he did not recognize it as being a portrait of any one he had ever seen, nor did he take it very seriously as a clue. "I am quite sure," he said, "that Joseph Crawford has not been interested in any woman since the death of his wife. He has always seemed devoted to her memory, and as one of his nearest friends, I think I would have known if he had formed any other attachment. Of course, in a matter like this, a man may well have a secret from his nearest friends, but I cannot think this mild and gentle looking lady is at all concerned in the tragedy." As a matter of fact, I agreed with Mr. Porter, for nothing I had discovered among the late Mr. Crawford's effects led me to think that he had any secret romance. After Mr. Porter's departure, I studied long over my puzzles, and I came to the conclusion that I could do little more until I should hear from headquarters. Chapter 14.